Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Carl Brook, and I'm Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. And I am pleased to host this seminar on migration with dignity, lessons from Pacific Islanders in the United States. The common narrative of climate refugees is widespread and not very nuanced. And the reality of migration is for multiple reasons. And the importance of those reasons evolve over time, as do the reasons for return or not return. There are different pathways. It's not just moving from A to B. It might be A to B to C, back to A, back to C, then to D. There's a lot of movement. Migration is but one of the adaptations that we can see in responding to climate change. And we see this in a number of instances that migration is not a foregone conclusion. It is but one thing that people do. For the last 2 years, the Environmental Law Institute has partnered with the University of Tokyo, Hosei University, the OPRI, Ocean Policy Research Institute, and partners in Pacific Island countries, Arkansas, and Oregon. Notably today, I'd like to recognize the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese and the Micronesian Islander community, who worked very closely with us on the research that we are presenting today. The focus of our research is on migration with dignity. Part of it, I think some of the interesting parts are about why do people migrate, why do they return or not return. But our focus really is on the quality of life that people have after they migrate. What are their expectations when they migrate? What is the reality that faces them when they arrive? And so this question of what skills people have and how does that comport to the expectation that they're going to have is framed within this concept of migration with dignity, which was articulated by former Kiribati President Anote Tong. The idea behind migration with dignity is that people should not move when they have to move, when all their assets have been wiped out by a cyclone, but that they move when they want to move, and that they have the skills, that is the education, the vocational skills, the life skills, they have the skills that people are able to maintain their cultural identity, and that they have access to education, employment, and healthcare. And so that's kind of the starting point. We're focusing on how can we better facilitate migration when people want and under favorable terms, so that people have wherever they go. And with that, I'd like to, before I invite Professor Nakayama to provide some introductory remarks and orientation, I want to briefly introduce the panelists that we will have here. So Professor Nakayama is a professor in the Department of International Studies at the University of Tokyo. He's a longtime partner of ELI. We've worked on so many interesting projects together. Then we will have a presentation looking at Marshallese migrating from the Marshall Islands to Arkansas, presented by Melissa Leyland, who's the director of the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese, and Dr. Shana McLean, who's a visiting policy analyst at BLI. We'll then have a presentation by Kapiolani Miki, who is with the Micronesian Islander community, and Scott Drinkle, visiting researcher at ELI, looking at 3 populations of Pacific Islanders coming to Oregon. We'll then, before we shift into the question and answer, we'll have a few comments from Erin Daly, who's a professor of law at Widener University in Delaware. Erin and her colleague Jimmy May have been pioneers in what are called dignity rights. And so looking at, not so much on the migration side, but you want experts on dignity, that is they. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Nakayama.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much, Carl, for introducing me. And my short presentation is about what we have done and maybe what we are doing from now. Okay. Well, most of the people in this room have seen this, in that IPCC predicts that by the end of this century, we may observe the sea level rise nearly by 1 meter or more. And so to speak, atoll countries in the Pacific, namely Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Tuvalu, would be largely impacted, or quite a bit of the land should be submerged because of the sea level rise. And well, this is one of the latest news clips about the statement by Hilda Hein, the president of the RMI. And she says that, I'm sure there are people who are leaving because of the threat of climate change. And in this country, probably that around 30,000 of the Marshalese have already emigrated. Out of 100,000, this is the total population of the Marshall Islands. And roughly speaking, half of them are in the island, and half of them have already left the island, leaving this country and other countries. And well, on the left side, this is one of the latest news broadcasted in New Zealand, says that Marshall Islands rules out relocation in climate, well, combating with climate change. What they will do? Marshall Islands considers islands built up for climate change adaptation. And on the right, this is what the country of the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, the same situation as atoll countries in the Pacific, namely, the country is composed of atolls. They will be, and these atolls will be heavily impacted by sea level rise. And they are now reclaiming one island so that they put more sand and clay to raise the ground level up so that this island may survive, say, even if that they observe the sea level rise of 1 meter or more. And they called it the City of Hope. And I was in the Marshall Islands, Majuro, just 2 weeks ago. And I met with the Japanese government people there, in particular, our ODA agency, JICA people. And I was told that now the government of the Marshall Islands is very keen to push this idea. And my country, Japan, was asked to assist them in one way or another. Having said that, 3 countries in the Pacific, Federal State of Malaysia, Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Palau, in these 3 countries have agreement with this country, United States of America, named Compact of Free Association. What does it mean? The citizens of these 3 countries may live and work in USA without visa or without quotas, which means they show up at any American airport only with passport, and they are permitted to stay in this country as long as they want. A very unique arrangement, and well, I don't think many Americans do know the existence of such an agreement. So this is a research question of ours for our survey carried out about the from the atoll country, namely Marshall Islands, ready to immigrate abroad. Then, have immigrants from the atoll countries succeeded in re-establishing their livelihood after relocation? The methodologies are that 1, we carried a survey with college students and actually college and university students islands regarding their aspiration to migrate. Second, we also carried out survey with immigrants who are already here in this country from the Marshall Islands regarding their livelihood after relocation. But we are also keen to see the situation in the volcanic island, which means non-atoll country. And we have selected federal state of Micronesia as a reference vis-a-vis Marshall Islands as an atoll country. And so we really wanted to see college students in federal state of Micronesia in the same or different opinion vis-a-vis college and university students in the Marshall Islands about their aspiration to migrate to abroad. Second, do immigrants from FSM to this country experience differently from the immigrants from the Marshall Islands, or their experiences are somewhat similar? So we have additional set of research questions. The only difference between this one and the previous one is the name of the country. One, about the Marshall Islands. Two, about federal state of Micronesia. And we carried out case studies about the Republic of the Marshall Islands. We carried a survey in Majuro, the capital city or capital island atoll of the Marshall Islands, into one college of the Marshall Islands, and one university of the South Pacific, Marshall Island campus. Then we carried a survey about immigrants in Springdale, Arkansas, and Salem and Portland in Oregon. And regarding the federal state of Malaysia, we carried a survey with the students of the College of the Micronesia. And we also carried a survey about immigrants at Salem and Portland, Oregon. This morning, we will listen to two presentations. One about Marshall Islands, the survey in the Marshall Islands, and the survey in the destinations, Springdale. And the two about FSM, again, survey in the island and the survey in the destinations, the area between Salem and Portland in Oregon. And I'm tempted to give you just one small findings out of research, that we found that nearly 60% of the immigrants from federal state of Malaysia to Oregon left the island, mostly to the United States, within 1 month of deciding. So they leave the country almost unprepared. And I think it's like this. Assume that I'm in federal state of Micronesia, college student in Pompeii. I got a telephone call from one of my uncles living in this country. Hey, Mickey, why don't you join us? I will give you an air ticket. Then I leave my country in a week, 2 or 3 at most. Then I presented these findings in the College of the Micronesia itself, in front of the faculty members and the students. And a couple of faculty members stood up and deplored that, oh yes, and leave the college even in the middle of semester. They just quit. They don't finish the college. They simply disappear. It implies that the value of education, in particular to secure degree, whatever it is, wasn't understood by the college students in the country. And moreover, those immigrants, like uncles, who invite the students to USA, do not inform the student of the importance of education and possessing a degree for their livelihood after they are coming here. And I'm also tempted to spend a few more slides about our further development in that. As Carl mentioned, we carried a survey about aspiration of the people to emigrate. And I visited the Marshall Islands 7 times in implementation of this project in last 2 years. And we talked a lot with the faculty members of the college and university. And I found that they are very keen to learn what kind of elements is the most influential in the development of the perception about climate change in the mind of their students. So we developed a small project titled How Religion, Culture, and Education Influence the Perception of People about Climate Change. And we carried a survey to see this in the Marshall Islands, in one college, and in one university. And well, I don't think I should spend much time about this, but our research concept is that the perception about climate change should be composed of religion, culture, and education, three factors. And we put questions to these students and got answer, and we modeled it. And the model implies that three methods from simple scoring, structural equation modeling, and Bayesian structural equation modeling, which is really the state-of-art way of modeling to see what they have in mind. And this methodology is widely used in psychology. And this is the last slide. And I just want to share with you just one of the findings, which I see it very interesting that, well, we put 20 plus questions about this. And one of the questions is like this: the atoll country will never stop climate change. For, according to the Bible, God said, I once promised Noah that I would never again destroy the earth by a flood. And another question: I am certain that sea level rise is taking place. And the students are asked to select one out of 5 choices. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And interestingly, the majority of the students said, I agree, or I strongly agree to both of these questions. So, on one hand, they believe that my country will not be flooded. Believe that, or they also perceive that sea level is rising. And well, and how, I mean, such an behavior or mindset of the student should be interpreted is still an open question. But we wonder whether, if that such a tension does exist in their mind, it could be a hindrance to migration by climate change. That they may be observing the sea level rise, and they may want to emigrate. But on the other hand, they still know that God said that my country will not be submerged. And just a small commercial. And all the findings out of from the surveys and the researches we have carried out will be published as a special issue of the Journal of Disaster Research in this December 1st. And this is free access online journal, and everybody can get some of these papers or all of these papers free of charge. And this special issue includes case studies in the Marshall Islands, federal state of Micronesia, and Kiribati as origin of. And this special issue also includes articles about our case studies done in their destinations, namely Portland, Salem, and Springdale in this country, and Suva in Fiji, and Vienna in Austria. And in addition, it includes 2 articles from our second survey, namely How Religion, Culture, and Education Influence the Perception of People and Climate Change Study. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'd like to quickly invite Shana and Melissa up for the second of the 3 presentations.
Melissa.
Thank you. just make sure. Good morning, everyone. Okay,
So we'll start our presentation with just a little bit of background of the Marshall Islands. I know maybe perhaps most of you all are wondering. Um, so the Republic of the Marshall Islands, it's a group, really it's just composition of groups of islands and atolls. There are 5 islands and 29 atolls. The way to simply put, I like to put it this way: if we want to compare the size of it to anything in the United States, I would say it's pretty much the same size of Washington D.C. So imagine Washington D.C. all cramped up. You ball it up and scatter it all over the Pacific Ocean. So that's a good analogy, right? Um, so the relationship with the United States really began in 1986 when Compact of Free Association came in place, and I like to call that. I always, when I have this discussion with people, I try to simplify it as much as I can. So it's really the marriage agreement between the United States and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And what does that entails? It really, this is where, we come across that. I like to say we always fall through the cracks because it does give you this freedom, free movement to go back and forth between 2 countries with no limitation. However, Marshallese are not considered U.S. citizens or not even national. So that's where things really get complicated when you speaking in terms of accessing federal and state programs, even the basic programs like the Medicaid or sometimes they call it food stamp or stuff like that. Um, so that's where things really get complicated. But in that agreement, there's this two-way street, sort of, where the U.S. provide majority of the financial assistance to the government, and also the Marshallese really suffer a lot. I mean, they sacrifice a lot. They also provide their lands for security purposes. One being there's a Ronald Reagan missile range in Kwajalein, and what that is basically the interceptor. Just imagine if our favorite friends, Russians, want something from their country. Guess where that interceptor is going to come from? It's going to come from the Marshall Islands. Yes, so there's a lot of things that are hidden that most people don't realize, that there's that relationship of COFA, but however, there are other things behind there as well. Well, Arkansas, right? Why did we move to Arkansas? That story started late 70s, early 80s, when a young man, John Moody, actually moved. When that happened, there was an opportunity for Marshallese to go to school in the United States to attend post-secondary. So John Moody was one of the first guys that really jumped into that and was sent to Kansas. But he had a lot of issues with tuition and stuff like that. So he ended up marrying a beautiful lady from Arkansas. And they moved to Springdale, Arkansas. And he started bringing his families in, and then those families started bringing their extended family members in. So that's how the story goes. So thanks to Tyson and those folks there that provide the accessibility to employment. It's a basic labor entry employment, make it a lot more friendlier for Marshallese to move to Arkansas as well. The infrastructure is there, and you'll see this when we move on to the other slides as well. Today, there are around 17,000 residents, Marshallese, in Springdale. Even that number is still a big question mark because the census that was done in 2010, there were a lot of discrepancies in there, and we just thought that number would reflected a little bit over 4,300. But that number there, we took it, we consider the number, the record of the schools, from the record from the schools and the birth records and the general population. You add all of that together. So that's the estimate that we're thinking. Um, Really today, Marshallese are now moving. We're now moving into other areas as well, like Washington, Oregon, Oklahoma, Hawaii, New Mexico, and California there. What we're seeing in Arkansas, though, we're seeing Marshallese that tend to move to other states because they have better, they have access to programs like Medicaid and sort of those things, especially when elders are sick and they cannot no longer work. Families tend to take them to those states where those benefits are available.
Okay, and so now we're going to move into the actual research itself. And two sets, pardon me, two sets of research elements were taken into account here. One, as Mickey mentioned earlier, we looked at College of Marshall Islands students that were in various stages of attending school, living in Majuro. And then we also, and we're going to be comparing this research to what was done in Springdale with the help of ACOM. So to give you some basic information about the College of Marshall Islands students that were interviewed, from March to April of 2018, 99 self-completion surveys were distributed. This research was not conducted by myself, but by two teachers teaching at the College of Marshall Islands, Jennifer Saru and Herman Lahar. And they were able to essentially take different times to go out to the campus and poll random students. It's my understanding that these surveys were conducted in English, and most of the students that were interviewed, 84%, were in the first or second year of college. I think this is important to note mainly because, as Mickey mentioned earlier, sometimes you don't see many students pass or complete college. Maybe the focus of attending education isn't maybe shared by their parents, or maybe other needs arise. And so we saw a large majority in the first and second year, but quite a small amount in the third and fourth year. And of that grouping, 69% spoke conversational to fluent English. And then Melissa will talk a little bit about the Springdale research that was conducted, which was supported by ACOM.
So as you can tell, we were involved in this research as well. So from June 23rd to August 18th, that's the research was conducted. The way we did it, we were very intentional in selecting our samples. So we really got individuals that knew a lot about the story behind migration, and also just random regular people, And when I say people who knew a lot about migrations, I'm talking about community leaders and faith-based leaders as well. So 29 interviews were done, 45 self-completions, and we had interpreters there that were available at these interviews as well for those who needed that service. For first generation Marshallese as well, as you can tell, that 42% had a high school, some high school diploma, and 40, there's some age, okay.
Yeah, it's 42%.
Even.
Yeah, they
Yes.
had either attended some high school or had received a diploma, and then 13 and a half had some college, but very small amounts, just also similar to CMI, you know, had not fully completed high school or college, and some had just middle school education.
51% of them spoke pretty good, you know, moderate to fluent English, and that's because the language that we're taught when we go to school in the Marshall Islands is English. So you are taught to write in English as well and speak that language.
The interpreters were often used during the interviews, though, because I think even if they are able to speak English, it was much more comfortable for them to speak freely and openly with people who were speaking Marshallese. So it was a definite benefit to have that as an option. And then the surveys that we distributed, which also was through the help of ACOM, were translated by ACOM into Marshallese as well. So we had a pretty solid response rate as a result. I think it really supported the information. And just as a point, so we're talking about CMI students who are living in Majuro currently compared to first-generation Marshallese who were born in the Marshall Islands but now live in Springdale, Arkansas. So when we look at some of the reasons for migration that were identified, we've heard this previously from Mickey, but and also in relation to the COFA, it's often thought that one of the main reasons is for health issues, the need for health care because of, you know, the past activities that led to the COFA being developed with bombing and et cetera. But there's also an idea that a lot of Marshallese are migrating to the United States because of climate change. In our surveys, what I thought was interesting is that when you interviewed both the CMI students and those from Springdale, health was relatively low on the reasons for their migration. And part of my percentage is hidden for Springdale. It's 15% that related or responded to moving for health. But the same 4 reasons appeared in both cases. Education, jobs, family, and health are the primary reasons. And then in Springdale, I think we see 36% responding for family, and it's similar to what Mickey mentioned. A lot of times you get a call and the family asks you to move there. And there are nested reasons within that request. So it's not just come to Marshall, come to Springdale. It's come to Springdale because, you know, either we need health care, you know, maybe one of the family members is getting old, or a family member has a child that they'd like to have help with, or they need financial support. And so they ask the person to come and get a job and support the family. But it also speaks to kind of this idea of family, which is that you don't have to be blood relatives to be part of the family. And so a lot of this comes from, you know, extended, would you like to talk about this a little bit, the sister and?
Oh, so the family structure is a lot different from what most of you are used to. So it's the extended kinship, family structure. That means if, and I will use this for an example, my sister, she has her own kids. I'm a sister to her. So in our culture, her children are mine as well. So we have a concept of shared property, and all the way up to the child. So even your cousin, we like to call it cousin or cousin sister because it's very gender based. If with me and my brother, our children are going to be cousin. With me and my sister, our children are going to be brothers and sisters. But even our children, even my cousin's children, they are mine as well. So it's a lot different, and you know, this is where we have complex issues with adoptions. When you have Marshallese tend to adopt out their children, is because, you know, of this idea of your your children are shared among family members, but sometimes that is outside of that group that we're speaking in terms of. So yeah, it's a very close kinship, and we consider everyone is a family member. Even the great uncle is also a very close family member.
And this will come up a little bit more later when Melissa talks about some of the services that ACOM offers, because this kind of family structure isn't necessarily easy when you're trying to put children into school systems in the United States. So issues of informal adoptions that are recognized in the islands versus formal, what we need is a formal adoption here in the US is an issue. So just one last slide, one important note before I move on. What is interesting is when interviewing those in Springdale about climate change, thank you. Migration due to climate change was not listed as a driving or main factor. It would come up here and there, but it wasn't a main reason for them moving. What was a consideration of climate change, though, was whether they would return or not. So they would often cite, yes, we're interested in going back for family, events, but we will not return permanently because of climate change. So moving into expectations for migration, when interviewing the CMI students, 80% indicated they intended to move to the United States, but they had a more planned approach. The majority thought, they'd have about 5 years, maybe they'd complete college before they'd move. They knew that they had family to stay with. The majority indicated they had someone, either a close family member or extended family member to stay with. 92 expected to be able to find a job easily and to be able to work upon arrival, and that they thought that the fact that they were attending college and that their interests were putting them on a path to get the kind of job that they wanted once they arrived. Comparatively, when you look at the Springdale residents, most often we found that they would move within 1 or 3 months of being called. So they didn't have much planning at all. They did move in immediately with family members or extended family members, and most of them reported that it was very easy to find a job. However, maintaining a job and keeping the job is where a lot of the issues lie. And so 48% of who we surveyed and interviewed were employed and 45% were unemployed. So when we're talking about managing information for expectations, where do they get their information from? How prepared are they to move? Most of the CMI students indicated that they were getting information from family and from schools. But those that are living in Springdale indicated that they were surprised to find that once they arrived in Arkansas, that the high school and college education credits did not transfer equally. And so there were not equivalent levels. If you came in at 12th grade in high school, you would go back sometimes 2 or 3 years. And then the same with your certificates. Perhaps you had a professional job doing nursing or as a contractor in the Marshall Islands. The position here in the United States wouldn't recognize the certificates or the diplomas, or additional experience was needed. And so 52% of who we interviewed and surveyed in Springdale had a different job from what they had either gone to school for or what they had previously worked at in the Marshall Islands. And again, just speaking to this idea of why it's difficult to maintain employment, family responsibility in the culture was often cited as a reason. There are a number of weddings, funerals, births, things to celebrate, and it's within the culture to make this a primary responsibility. But it's not necessarily complementary to our work culture here in the US, where you can't have off for weeks at a time or give very little notice. And so family responsibilities were often at odds with maintaining employment. The paperwork that you receive when you come in to the United States, you have to maintain it over time, but it can be lost or expensive. And so these are prohibiting factors as well. Transportation in Arkansas in particular, public transportation isn't very strong. They rely heavily on their family. And so if you've got one car for a family of 7 or 8 people, possibly more, then that one car doesn't go very far in getting everybody to work on time or regularly. And then even though a large number speak English, there's still difficulty in understanding what some of the supervisors are saying to them. So now we're getting to this issue of like contributing to the quality of life. So again, I mean, we're thinking of what could happen before they leave and what happens when they arrive. And the majority of those that we talked to about what would have made the situation better for you. Maybe you're getting information from, your family members in schools, but it doesn't appear to be the right information. Or the information you need to really easily transition into certain areas. And so the vast majority said that before leaving, what they would really like to know is what the reality of the situation, where there's a better network of communicating some of these challenges that we've identified so far. And then once they arrive, it's more about the locational access. So, our certificates don't transfer, our diplomas don't transfer. What do we do about it? Where do we go? Who do we talk to? And then, how do we get around? How do we navigate the region? And how do we handle certain life skills like having a banking account with checking and savings and managing a paycheck that's quite larger than what you might see in the Marshall Islands? And so from these challenges, we came up with a few options for improving transition. And then Melissa will talk a little bit about what ACOM does. But essentially, the development of an upon arrival approach in Arkansas would certainly be beneficial. There are initiatives like Welcoming Northwest Arkansas that is trying to push approaches like this, but it's for newly migrating populations more broadly, not just Marshallese, although it's certainly going to be beneficial to say, this is where health and education services can be provided or accessed, or even access to legal information. Because on one hand, what happens if you're driving without a driver's license? You need to know, how to defend yourself, but also if there are issues with maybe the transition in the neighborhood, people aren't as welcoming of other types of people, other cultures. You need to know what your legal rules are that are available to you. And then from an educational perspective, offering courses on life skills or incentives that will help these people. So Melissa mentioned Tyson's is a large employer of Marshallese. And what we have seen is that they have an internal educational mechanism to provide English classes, English as second language classes, but also classes on driver's ed. And in order to, when you take these classes, the incentive is that they would offer college reimbursement, but many of those that are there aren't actually interested in going to college, but instead more upward mobility. So, I think one suggestion would be for some of the local providers to look more into basic skills like how to use computers, how to manage financial issues that would help them move up in that way. And then this idea of developing cooperative agreements that would also either, provide educational equivalencies among schools or transfer the credits more easily from one university to another.
So we heard there's many complexities that exist, and how do they transpire those and make a living, make it more easier for them? So what ACOM did was trying to tailor programs that are directly affecting and make impact on the community. So we thought of things like the newcomer orientation program, the driver's license and the safety course in Marshallese. The driver's license is available in Marshallese as well due to advocacy work that has been done in the past. We also we heard about having issues with living paycheck to paycheck. Perhaps give some kind of a financial education program that will work for them. Give them education on budgeting, banking, those things that we know are very essential in this life, especially here in America. We do have a child IDA program, adult IDA program as well. Youth mentoring and tutoring program. I'm going to run through them pretty quick because I think we are running out of time. But how do you maintain your cultural identity? We also give cultural education to our youth as well as part of our youth program. So ACOM, what ACOM had become over the year is basically a social service provider. We do connection through food pantries. We do every year. We're involved in marketplace, or some like to call it Affordable Care Act. Since Marshallese don't have access to Medicaid, one way for them to get it to the marketplace. So we want to make sure that's one of our priorities. Legal documents like adoptions, I-94. If they lose their I-94, they will not be able to get a job. So what we do every month is we make a border run. We actually run to the border. Make a trip to the border, yes. Every month we make effort to do that, to make sure that people keep their job or find a job. And then things like intra-family adoptions as well, where we keep our children to us. And we try to, we promote that instead of adopting out your children, just really keep those children next to you and your family. These are just few services that we provide. If I have to list all of the things that we do, you're gonna get tired. So I think we just decided to select only a few of them. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have one more presentation, and then we will open up for discussion. I'd like to invite Cappy Mickey and Scott Drinkle up for the third presentation. That's there. So just use that.
Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Good morning. My name is Kapiolani Miki. I'm a staff at the Micronesian Islander community in Salem, Oregon, as a community health worker. And with me is Scott. He's he's the visiting researcher from ELI. Last fall, MIC and ELI created a partnership to better understand the experience, challenges, and opportunities of Micronesian living in Oregon. So we focused on three communities: Chukis, Marshallese, and all three groups are like largest population in Oregon. So MIC, so we can locate people to interview. Today we will be presenting results and key findings of that research.
Great, thank you, Kathy. So as was mentioned, one of the purposes of the research is what the needs are of these three communities. And you'll see that there are similarities among the three communities in Oregon and the Marshallese in Springdale, and also some differences as well. And we also made brief comparisons with those back home on the islands. You can see the two research questions up there. Some of the overarching themes that emerged from the research so far, that the transition to life in the US is experienced differently across cohorts among the three populations that we looked at, and also within those populations. migrants wish to be better equipped, and that involves life skills, as was mentioned previously, and job training. And also we have a climate change factor here. It is a contributing factor among some who are emigrating. It may not be the primary driver, but it contributes. And it tends to actually be even larger factor for those deciding not to go back.
So in Portland, Salem, Oregon, in the area, one of the largest population of Micronesia. Like they have a lot of the population. So in history, in 1980s, some of our elders, I think also beyond that, they were recruiting to come to the Western Eastern Oregon University. So that's how some of our Chuukese migrate to Oregon for school. They come to school, after they finish, they go back. Some they stay, go back and recruit more people to come out. So, so the three target populations, Chuukese, Marshallese, and Palawan, were identified as both represented in the state as well as accessible by the interviewers. So the key partnerships, the Micronesian Islander Community and Environmental Law Institute. We're also collaborating with others like the FSM Consulate General, Oregon Health Authority, Nonprofit Living Islands, and the Chuukese Church, and etc.
So it really was a community effort to gather this data, and most especially with the help of the Micronesian Islander community.
So we have Jackie, she's the chair of the MIC. That's myself, and Sandy, she's from Palau.
Our research took place over a 3-month period. We conducted 76 interviews among the three populations with a focus on the Chuukese. With the Marshallese, that allows us the opportunity to compare and contrast with those in Springdale as well. Interviews were conducted in multiple languages regarding the ability of the interviewer, the interviewee, and the comfort level as well. English, Chuukese, and Palawan were the languages. And they occurred in a variety of areas, oftentimes in people's homes. And that was a comfortable place for people that they could share their stories in their homes with less of a hassle. The interview approach, how did we find our interviewees? It was through what's called a network sampling approach, where through established contacts with those with the Micronesian Islander community and other organizations that we worked with, some folks were identified, and then they would help us identify other folks as well. One limitation that should be noted in the overall data that we'll present, it's not meant to directly reflect these populations, but does provide a good indicator of some of their needs and opportunities. In this slide, we are looking at the overall perspective of the data that occurred in 2018. And there's a comparison here being made with the data found in the College of Micronesia study on those students. And unfortunately, the heading is missing there in this format. But the column on the left are the college students in Micronesia, and the column on the right are the general population that we interviewed in Oregon. And we used semi-structured interviews that allowed for consistency among the populations, but also the opportunity to dig a little deeper on some of the questions. And again, sorry about the formatting here, but the colors will work. So the three populations here, on the left is Chuukese, Marshallese in the middle, and Palau on the right. This is, the question is, where did you come from? Where were you living before Oregon? And there are differences here along these populations. And you can see the Chuukese, I know it's a little hard to look at, but the blue is that they came directly from their home country of Federated States of Micronesia. And interestingly, the majority had a stepping stone. And the gold is Guam. A lot of them had the opportunity to step before coming to the US mainland. And that's a place that they might gain English skills or learn about American culture. We also see in the Marshallese that most are coming directly from RMI, from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and from Palau, they are coming from other US states largely, and that the red for other is other US states. So there are different stories in how they're coming to the US, and they come at different times as well. The Marshallese have came much more recently, with an average year of 2012. For the Palauans, their average year that they arrived in Oregon was 1990. So there's different stories here. They've had time to establish community much earlier than the other two populations. And as was mentioned in the prior study, a lot of folks come with little notice or little preparation. And we just wanted to pull out a few quotations. We looked at data, but also the qualitative data matters as well, and the stories. I'll give you a moment just to take a look. So some are very intentional and come for educational purposes. In senior year of high school, I made up my mind to go to school outside CHUC. It didn't take me long because I know what I want. And for some, it did take a lot of planning, and family effort is involved. Oftentimes, family members need to provide airfare for them to facilitate their arrival. You can see in the middle quote, other family members are involved. My aunt said I had to go, and I left after 1 year of returning home to see my family. This is the A, C, B, D interlinkages among the locations. And finally, Dad told me to go to the US tomorrow. You're starting a new life in a new planet tomorrow. How do you prepare? Are you prepared? What do you expect will happen? We have seen these categories multiple times. But again, even though these are common factors for drivers for coming to the US or just emigrating generally, they are, when we dig deeper, there's differences here. And you can see for the Chuukese in blue from Federated States of Micronesia, jobs and education are primary drivers. For the Marshallese, many are coming for family responsibilities, to take care of a family member perhaps. And for the Palauans in gold, 94% indicated education as a driver. And the way that the survey question was asked, they could choose multiple responses. Oftentimes, someone is not only coming for a job or only coming for education. The issues are interwoven. We see on the bottom here, climate change is showing up, and that actually is a driver. It may not be a primary driver, but among the Marshallese in green, 25% indicated that was one of the factors for them leaving. This slide here looks, going back to the college students in Federated States of Micronesia, and it's the same. These are in order of ranking in prioritizing why they left Micronesia, and on the right, why they came to Oregon. This is a quotation by a Marshallese respondent. Climate change is an issue today, but not in the 1990s and early 2000s. Since 2012, the issue became with high tide, and it's why people are coming to the US. So it's a growing concern, and it's not the story for everybody, but it is the story for some. And again, apologies for the formatting here, but we're looking back at the college students in Micronesia on the left and general population in Oregon on the right. The college students were asked, is the sea level rising? And 74% said yes. The general population in Oregon was asked, do you see climate change affecting the Federated States of Micronesia? Do you believe that, or perceive that to be happening? And similarly, many said yes. This is an interesting point that could be explored further. For those in Oregon, 21%, so substantial number said no. There was a determined reasoning here that they did not believe climate change was affecting their homeland. On the left there for the college students, almost all of those others are I don't know. So there's we gather some results, but there's also some curious results that allow for further research. And just a couple more slides here. We can dig a little deeper on climate change and consider the religion of the respondent. And we have Catholic, Protestant, and unaffiliated. We're now grouping the three cohorts together to consider like a Pacific Islander mentality here and perception. So basically, the Protestants are in a little bit more disbelief than the Catholics, and even more so than the affiliated. So there's a religious signal. And as mentioned earlier, is climate change a factor for not wishing to return? Even more said, yes, it is, up to 25%, almost consider that a reason for not returning. We'll switch from climate change to job opportunities and livelihoods. That was the second part of the study, and we'll be wrapping up soon. So on the left are the college students in Micronesia. On the right, again, is the general population in Oregon. The college students were asked, do you believe you have the necessary skills to get a job after you emigrate? And then once they came to Oregon, they were asked, well, we asked, are you employed? And so there's actually an interesting similarity here that seems like the expectations line up. But there are challenges. It's not easy to get a job, and it might be easy to get some jobs, but not a job that pays the bills or that you feel satisfied with your life. And Kathy will talk about some of those challenges.
Okay, some of the challenges that we see among our three groups, especially among the Chuukese and the Marshallese, is like coming to work on time, transportation, language, just understanding the basic of different cultures. So we call it, there is a code, they call it Micronesian time, because if they say we're going to start at 1, we might come maybe at 3 or 4. So that's 1 o'clock for us. And I'm thinking, because back in our islands, we don't have a time frame. You can do anything whenever you want to. Unlike out here in the US, you have to do things according to time. So when we have something, so this is what we're trying our best, to improve upon, but it's improving, but not a lot. So that's why some have hard time maintaining jobs, because if they start at 10, they might come around 11 or 12. Same as keeping an appointment with the doctors, your appointment at 3, and then I show up at 3:30 or 4, and thinking that I'm still gonna see the doctor. So those are the kind of the difficulties understanding that in the US you have to go according to time. Also, transportation in Salem, we only have public transportation from Monday to Friday, and then it's challenging for others who works on the weekends. And when they depend on family member, and if that family member is willing or have the time to take you, then it might take you. So that's one of the challenges that we have. Also, understanding just the basic cultures, and as they also mentioned, family is one of the main things. So we depend on our family a lot, and also with the language barrier, it's very highly among our community members. So I think it depends on some of the people coming to Oregon from Chuuk. I'll speak mainly of the Chuukese, because back in Chuuk, if you go to a private school and you learn English, but if you go to a public school, then it's limited because they hardly. The main reason why when they come to the US, they have hard time understanding English, but they are trying their best too. And with some interpreters on the side, they're also, kind of lift them up, because they help them to apply jobs. They help them, to go to their appointments. So family is more like, for example, I was helping a family applying for housing, and when they say list your immediate family, so she lists all her family members, including her parents, her sisters. And then she called me and said, I'm not approved. And I look at her application. I say, oh, this is why, because in the US, when they say immediate family, it says you, your husband, and your kids, not your mom, not your sisters. So it's like a shock for some of our people who just, came out and started to learn more about the different cultures that they are living in. So I'm telling her, like, not like us, we say family, that means the whole clan, the whole group. But here, when they said immediate family, it's just you, your husband, and your kids. So that's why you're denied for housing. So that's also one of the challenges that gives people, member of our families, not to, sometimes they get kicked out of their house and stuff. And just
quotations here of some of those challenges that Kathy was mentioning. Public transportation has been an issue, as was noted. And then also sticking to what Kathy has been mentioning about culture. In our culture, the family we are related to, if someone passes away, we help each other. And this is brought up in the Marshallese study as well in Springdale. So just a little bit more data here. Taking those stories and putting them into quantified data. What would improve your quality of life before immigrating? And for many, they need to know more about life in America or in Oregon. But you can see we have the three cohorts here, and they have different needs that we've identified. And for the Marshallese, more needs were noted than for other groups, particularly compared to the Palauans. So there can be different strategies for addressing these needs because they do differ.
Just like understanding the law itself, it's very hard for them. Also, like navigating their way around around Salem itself, it's also hard. So these are like the stuff that we really need. We, as a community health worker, I'm like going all the way out to help people, like to make appointments, just to help them navigate around the system in Oregon, as well as schools. Sometimes we don't understand. Some parents, they don't understand, where to go to register their kids. Or, they have to take the test before they start attending school. So those are like the other difficulties that we have in Salem, Oregon. Besides, so we need like job trainings, life skill training, and like legal aid assistance. These are the stuff that the MIC is trying to connect with other people to help us, with the legal aid assistance. We already talked to some of the legal aid people that they can maybe talk to our community of like just the housing, know the laws about housing, like, the rental agreements. Because some of us, we don't know, like, for example, we don't wear our slippers inside our house. We leave it outside. We get right up for that. And it's just and people like to come in. So one time I told my manager, don't wear your slippers in my house. And she was like, what? I said, don't wear it. It's just something that it's more respect for my, for my place. If you want to come in, I know you're a manager, but this is my property. So it's like cultural differences. It's very hard when you come into the United States, and we really need help to, educate ourselves as, among our community members to understand and to know others, other cultures.
There's another story that Kathy shared dealing with dating, and not her own personal dating life, but of a community member. Would you like to share that?
Yeah, I used to live in Kansas City before I moved to Oregon. So I have a community member. He just came straight from Chuuk to the United States, and he went to McDonald's. He saw this girl. He really likes her. So he tried to go to talk to that person, and he doesn't know English, so he's trying to translate his, Chuukese to English, and that really sounds like he's harassing that person. And then he had to be in jail. So when they ask him his name is nobody. Oh no, it's somebody. And they thought he just didn't know English. So they have to wait for interpreter. So in 2 weeks he have to wait there. So when the interpreters come and he said, yes, that's his name. His name is somebody. So they were, just the naming your child, some people like, especially Amar, Islanders, we tend to name our kids after an experience, after, just like, so I was like, maybe, they were naming him after something that they experienced in their lives, because that's how we name our kids, either after our ancestors or after like a name of like the ocean or the navigating. If you're coming from a navigating family, then you tend to name your kids after that, to keep that in, still to be alive. So
it's a somewhat funny story, but it also captures all of these interweaving issues dealing with language, customs, legal knowledge, and there are real effects here. And this young man ended up in jail for 2 weeks for a misunderstanding. And so this research aims to bring those to light and to allow people to share their stories, and then to move from there and address those as best that we are able to and identify possible solutions. So, we'll end with just one final quotation here to give voice to the interviewees. It's a huge jump. There's no subsistence living here. It may be a shock for some to have to work here. I was raised somewhere where you feel secure on the other side of the road or up the hill. They are Chuukese. My kids in the US live in a different world. Parents struggle with how they will lay out the rules. And so we're moving into parenthood and the second generation now coming up in a new world. Thank you.
So before we open up for discussion, I'd like to invite Professor Erin Daly to share a few remarks. Here or there, as you like. Sure.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's great to see you and to be here. I've learned so much. So thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk about this. I guess a little bit of background about me, because Carl mentioned some of the work that I've been doing. So I just want to talk briefly about it, just so you know sort of the perspective that I'm coming from. As Carl mentioned, I've been working at the Delaware Law School with a colleague, Jimmy May, and we developed something called the Dignity Rights Project, which is a project that's dedicated to advancing human dignity in all different forms, mainly using legal tools through advocacy and education and litigation support and other sort of things like that. That project grew out of a book that I had written a few years ago called Dignity Rights. And the book was really an effort to understand how dignity is used in law. And what I did, sort of the research that I did for the book, was reading, you're going to think this is crazy, but this is what legal academics do, hundreds and hundreds of cases from around the world, from constitutional courts and other courts from around the world, on how they interpreted usually the dignity rights in their constitutions. Because what was interesting to me was that dignity was showing up. It's now in about 150, more than 150 constitutions around the world, and more courts are taking those clauses seriously and applying them to specific situations. And I was interested to know if dignity means anything, if it has a meaning, and if so, what that meaning is, if it has any kind of sort of coherence to it. And what I found in my research was that even though the courts are coming at these questions in just an incredible variety of of factual situations, because dignity can arise in a whole bunch of different factual contexts. Basically, anytime there's a human right or important interest at stake, you can make a dignity argument about it. And the courts were, as I mentioned, really from around the globe, in every sort of jurisprudential tradition that you can think of, where courts are active, they were talking about dignity. And so what was interesting to me was that when you looked at this whole body of law, it kind of fell into, most of the way that dignity was being talked about fell into basically one of three categories. And I've used that structure of looking at dignity in one of three sort of categories, if you will, for a lot of the other dignity work that I've been doing. And to that, I've added a fourth category. So I'll just mention what those are. And then as I talk about them, we'll see that much of what has been said, pretty much everything that has been said this morning, also can be thought of as dignity in one of these different ways. So my hope is to just sort of provide a dignity framework for the issues that we're talking about and the situations that we're interested in here. So the four categories are, I'll just say them briefly and then I'll talk about them a little bit more. The first is what you might think of as individuation, like the idea of personal self-development, that people should have a right to develop their own life plans, to develop their own personalities, to make choices according to their own designs. So that's what I've sort of shorthanded as individuation. There's a second category of dignity issues that relates to sort of quality of life, what we might think of as quality of life, what in Latin America is called la vida digna, just sort of living with dignity, material conditions that are necessary to live a life of dignity. The third category is situations where people, for one reason or another, are not in control of their own circumstances and are dependent on others, usually on this, for everything or for anything. And that presents its own dignity challenges. It's one thing to say you can plan your own life, but if you're in prison or if you're in hospital or if you're in custody in one way or another, then it's much harder to do, and that presents its own different dignity challenges. So those are the three that I saw a lot of in the cases. And then the fourth that I've started recently to become more interested in is what I've been calling participatory dignity, which is the dignity interest in participating in the community, whether a social community, but often the political community. Like, how do you get involved? How do you engage? How do you become a member of that community? So what's been really interesting to me about the conversation that we've just been listening to is that nobody has mentioned the word dignity in their comments, but I've been seeing it everywhere. So let me just give you an example of how we might think of these issues that we're talking about in a way that helps us think in terms of this framework of migration with dignity. So first, the individuation issues. Just starting with a compact of free association, right? So the word free in there is meant to suggest it's your choice, right? You can come, you can go, limiting the sort of barriers of coming and going. So the idea of this form of migration and the rules associated with it are meant, in fact, to promote the human dignity in choosing whether you're going to stay someplace or whether you're going to go, and if you go someplace, whether you're going to stay there or go someplace else, right? So there was a lot of conversation about the decision to move, and in some cases, respondents in the survey said, I decided to move within 1 month, or I moved within 1 month of deciding to move. That makes the decision to move really interesting, right? It's possible that people had been thinking about it for a long time, and I suspect that in these communities where there's so much migration, no one's not thinking about it. But the actual decision to do it, and what are the factors that go into it, and what's the push and pull that goes into it? How much of it is somebody saying, I want to do this for my own self-fulfillment, or because I want a better life in the future, or I want my kids to have a better life? And how much are they doing it because somebody is either pulling them, I know you're happy where you are, but we really need your help over here, or pushing them, like the dad who says you need to go tomorrow? Sort of what are the dynamics there, and how does thinking about this in terms of dignity help us understand the decision-making process of migration that sort of initiates migration? There's a lot of other things that we talked about in terms of that go to sort of this idea of self-fulfillment, and that people migrate at some level, hopefully, for the desire or the intent of greater self-fulfillment. So people who go for reasons of education, they have educational opportunities where they are, and yet they seek other educational opportunities. And that brings up all kinds of really difficult questions about how, I don't know, how effective that those educational opportunities in the US in fact are. It's one thing to get into school, it's another thing to be able to stay in school, it's another thing to be able to really benefit everything that an educational opportunity has to offer. Language, time, other obligations, all kinds of things make actually taking full advantage of an educational opportunity may make that more difficult. So we want to think about sort of the dignity interests in having an education, not just in a formal sense, are you enrolled in school, but in really benefiting from it and having that really enrich your life. Same thing with jobs. Talked a lot about employment. Employment isn't so hard to find. You can get employment when you get here, and yet maintaining it can be very challenging, right? And the dignity cost of losing a job can be significant. So we look at employment as if it's a really good thing. 45% are employed, 63% are employed. Isn't that great? And it is. And yet there's a cost when people can't maintain their jobs, either for reasons that have nothing to do, that are completely outside of their control, like transportation issues, or things that are complicatedly inside or outside of their control, like time and language and things like that, that may make maintaining a job difficult, both from the employer's perspective. The employer might fire somebody, or from the employee's perspective, the employee might say, I just can't do this. This doesn't work. I don't understand what the expectations are. I don't understand how I'm supposed to do that. So all that sort of ties into how well migrants are able to plan their own lives and use the opportunity of migration as a way of bettering their own lives and fulfilling their own personalities. And there's a lot of overlap with these categories, right? But just as a way of sort of framing the issues a little bit. The second category, like living a life with dignity, material conditions of life. So we talked about access to benefits, access to social benefits. Again, maintaining a job, the income. Does that job even pay that you're trying so hard to keep? Does it allow you to live a life of dignity? And some of the conversation was about sort of life skills training. And I think that's a really important part of it, because really what's going on there is helping people live with dignity, right? Helping them negotiate the new culture, whether it's in formal terms, how do you say your name when somebody asks you? How do you deal with legal issues? How do you deal with signing up for things and all the paperwork and the bureaucracy that goes into everyday life in America? And how do you manage that? And also, how do you manage it while maintaining your own culture? So I think that part of the challenge is in living a life of dignity means to be able to understand that when somebody says show up at 10, you should show up at 10, without losing all the beauty of the culture that says 10 means sometime while the sun's up, or whatever it is, And the same thing with family, different definitions of family. Family obviously has a lot to do with the material comfort in which people live, not just in economic terms, but in sort of psychological, sociological terms, right? We want family to be together, and yet, again, we've you've talked about family definitions and how that can be difficult. So if your benefits are for your immediate family, that means those 4 people, not everybody else. And that's a hard thing to negotiate also. I was thinking also about the idea of spatial dignity, actually, and how you think about, I haven't lived in these places, but I have visited a little bit, but I imagine that just the sense of space is incredibly different. I'm thinking about you not seeing the ocean every day, which must be a real shock to the system, I would think, as well as just the sense of, you know, the way America looks is just so different than what you're used to or what your kids are used to, and how that affects people's ability to negotiate through the day, and that affects their sense of dignity. Whether inside or outside of the home, and the different sort of cultural norms and the different expectations that we have about that. Issues of dependence may be less prominent in this context. Certainly, I'm thinking about situations where people find themselves temporarily, one hopes, but in situations where they're in somebody else's control, whether in a jail situation, and the kind of dignity that one needs and the kind of dignity that you need if you come from one culture may be different than the kind of dignity that you get if you're in another culture. So thinking about dignity in those senses, also thinking about dignity just in terms of like hospital situations, or when you're dealing with medical profession or other kinds of professionals where you're dependent on them and you somehow need to negotiate that you have a different sense of how people should act towards you, how you, and they have a sense of how they should act. So I think there's those kinds of issues that we might think about in terms of dignity. And then finally, participatory dignity. I'm struck by, well, for first generation and then second generation and third generation, as these communities sort of get more and more entrenched within the United States and become more and more stable, and people have kids who are born here who intend to stay here, and how we meaning both the migrant community and the US-based community, how we think about integrating migrant communities into our political domain, voting rights, but not just voting rights, engagement rights of all kinds, civic dignity, all kinds of opportunities to run for office, to speak up at a school board meeting, to engage in whatever way with sort of what we might call as a general matter governance issues. So I offer these thoughts just in case it's useful to think about as we think about sort of this framework of migration with dignity. If we want to think about how dignity really affects people who are in this process of migration, from the moment of decision to many, many years down the line, and many, many even generations down the line. So thank you very much.
So we have about half an hour. Thank you so much to all the panelists and to Erin for her comments. I think I've got so much I want to say, but you guys have been very patient. I'd like to open it up. We also have people online, so if you would like to ask questions, please type them in and we can address them. I'd like to start with a kind of a series of questions, then go to the panelists, and then if we have time, we can do another round or two. There are microphones around you. If you want to speak, please turn it on. You can grab that. And please introduce yourself.
So I just press here and hold it up to my...
Wait for it to turn green. Thumb off?
Am I supposed to press this button?
Yeah. I can give you this one. Okay. Here. Go ahead.
Because another one is turning green.
Okay. Here, let's take this one. Go ahead. Yeah, you just press it once.
Oh.
So,
All right, well, my name is Marisa Ensor. I'm currently based at Georgetown University. Thank you to the presenters for a fascinating panel. And my question pertains to the finding that climate change is not frequently reported as a primary driver for their decision to migrate. As a field researcher, I'm curious about how the question was posed to the study participants. I don't work in this part of the world. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and I study human environmental relations in conflict-affected regions, most intensely in South. And so I'm kind of drawing comparisons between my research and what you have reported. So in South Sudan, climate change is a primary factor for their conflict and their internal as well as cross-border migration. They are experiencing one of the most dramatic increases in temperature. They are experiencing desertification, and perhaps even more serious is the changing pattern of alternating dry season and rainy season that makes it impossible for them to predict their normal transhuman migration. Okay, now local people are acutely aware of these changes. Okay, and now if I were to ask them, is climate change a primary factor in your internal displacement or in the way in which conflict is being fought? If I phrase it like that, they would say no. However, they constantly mention the immediate consequences of climate change. So the term climate change is not part of their vocabulary, but drought, food insecurity, unpredictability of weather patterns, flash floods, the direct consequences. They talk about that constantly. And so similar to what Erin mentioned about dignity not having been mentioned explicitly, but you've seen it everywhere, that's what I see over there. They don't mention climate change, but they're acutely aware that it is climate change what is affecting essentially their human environmental as well as social and conflict related relations as well as migration. So I would be curious to see how you phrase the question and how it was understood by your study participants.
Thank you. Other questions before we? No other questions. Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah. There's a microphone right there.
This one works, I think. I hope.
Just press it once.
Immigrant labor, of course. Hi, my name is Lele. Very interesting presentations, and it's really good to see how the grassroots communities are dealing with the issues directly affecting their colleagues and compatriots. A question, however, to the professor about the dignity. Do you think that perhaps, if you consider that the Pacific migration eastwards was the largest movement of people in the history of humanity eastwards, right? So migration is very much in our blood. I'm from there as well. But do you think that perhaps the abdication of dignity is the first thing that they consciously do when they move to another place, which is completely free of any of the parameters of what is recognized as dignity in their own place? And whether, after abdicating dignity when they move, that they spend the next generation trying to regain it in their new land? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm with the U.S. Department of the Interior, and I have a question concerning the manner in which the different states migrants within the United States have come, whether or not they're being warmly welcomed with respect to the resources that are available. I know that there's a large call from within Hawaii, for example, for compact impact aid because of the great financial impact that the migrants are having upon the different states. So I'm wondering, what is the availability for a voice such that that is being recognized by the elected officials, and what type of resolution is being provided?
Okay, here. Great.
Thank you. I'm Yuko Hamada from International Organization for Migration. Couple of questions to all researchers. First of all, did you find any differences in findings, between the ages? Okay, one of the target was on the students in the university. Did you have a chance to talk to some of the older folks, that was who came to U.S. After the initiation of the compact? Secondly, did you have a chance to talk to some of the policymakers especially in the origin side? What do they see? This 1/3 of the population in one place went to U.S. It's a big brain drain it can be, or the population flow. So what do they see, and what are the initiatives are they taking? And then thirdly, do you have any recommendations to organizations like us, UN, IOM, International Organization Agency? We do implement a large number of programming, for instance, a pre-departure orientation, reintegration in some places, not in the US, migrant resource centers. So there are a lot of examples can be replicated, but over to you. Thanks.
Okay, let's let the panel have a chance to respond to those questions. And
Sure. All the questions?
I would say the ones that
Pertain to
particularly pertain to you. I would say especially the welcomed by the states and the ages and.
So the first question about was the question asked, and why climate change was not the main driver. If I recall correctly, we were straight with the questions. Why did you move, right?
Well, in regard to the climate change question, we did. Initially, it was posed in the interviews as climate change, but it was, there were elements where, because the interviews were done open-ended, we could talk to them. Well, are there examples of elements that you've seen? What are the effects on the island that you've experienced? And so then you get a greater context for, our wife's or uncle's, house has been eaten by the ocean, or the school doesn't exist anymore where it was before. And so you start understanding that it's sea level rise and certain weather events that they identify as opposed to climate change itself. Yes.
If I may, the other thing that I think is interesting here is that the same person is being asked in the receiving communities. The same person is being asked, why did you come, and what are you planning on going back, and why not? So the same people are saying, I didn't come because of climate change. I'm not going back because of climate change. 80% in Springdale that we interviewed said they don't plan to go back. And one of the top reasons was climate change. So however they framed it, there was kind of a one-way signal. I think this goes to one of the concepts that Erin, I think, importantly articulated. That's the push and pull. The people, they may be kind of thinking about these things, but they aren't pushed yet to move to Arkansas. They're pulled by education, healthcare, jobs, but there's a resistance. So they're not pushed by climate change yet. It's kind of there, but the proximate cause of leaving is a pull rather than a push.
I think the result was not surprising to us, because we have those daily interaction with the community, and we have these conversations with them all the time. And when we do our own assessment, climate change was not the main driver. So we weren't surprised at all.
Mickey, would you like to jump in?
Sure, yes. So I have two responses. One, how that we asked about climate change. I have the questionnaire in front of me. I know what climate change is. Please circle one out of 4. A, yes, I know the cause of climate change and its effect. B, I have only heard of it. C, I think the climate change is a hoax. D, I don't know. And as for my suggestion for IOM, yes, I definitely have one. I visited your office in Majuro several times, and they provided me with a copy of the pre-departure orientation training curriculum, which is for the people who are about to emigrate to United States, starting from how the driving license should be secured, how they shop, and unfortunately, it is available only as paper copies. So we had a seminar just last week in Oregon, and I asked the immigrants, how many of them have ever seen this? Only 1 or 2 hands. And so I sent my email to a colleague in Majuro, and she just now replied saying that I think the idea of having the resources available online and in multiple languages is a good idea. I hope they will do that. Thank you.
I think I'll continue, especially Insular Office with the Compact Impact Fund. That's really something that me and the Consul General in Arkansas always talk about, and I know the ambassador as well. How do we, Arkansas does not receive anything. So that's something that I know the Consul General is pretty heavy about talking to politicians and even to folks like Chamber of Commerce. And I think there is a bill that's coming up that's basically supposed to recognize Marshallese in Arkansas as part of that community there. So we're hopeful that particular bill will kind of like the stepstone to a lot of other things, including the Compact of Free Association, Compact Impact Fund. So does that make any sense? Yeah.
On that point, I'm just wondering if Kathy had any thoughts on how the states, the host communities, are responding to the influx of immigrants and
in Oregon, we have some issues, but right now we, like the MIC and the CAN, we were working with the legislature, and so we work on working on our IDs and driver license, because every year we have to renew. And then we started to explain to them our status in the US. So then they approved that our IDs and then the driver license have to be expired within 5 years, after 5 years. So, but before that, we have that 5 years. And then later it's like they cut us out and they just give us like 1 year. So every year we have to go back to them and explain who we are and what we are to the US. So, and then now we have that in place. After 5 years, we, renew our license. And then we also ask for, insurance, because we work, we pay tax, we pay medical, all this stuff that they deducted from your check. And we said, why do we have to work and pay for all this when we cannot get the insurance, from the Medicare or Medicaid? So we work hard on that, and we lobby, and we do a lot of stuff, talking to and do a lot of testifying with the representative and the senators. And then now we're glad it's been 3 years that we have a COFA premium insurance from Oregon. So that's a very helpful, within just living, within Oregon, and also in Seattle and Vancouver, Washington. They also last year they just approved that they can also use the COFA premium insurance. So each state have a different form of insurance, but at least it's like a lift up for our community members who, the purpose of their coming out to the U.S. is to seek medical help. So the COFA premium insurance is very helpful to us over there. And we're still facing a lot of discrimination too. A lot of our families, because some of our children, they want to play with their neighbors, and because of that skin color, and I never knew it still exists, discrimination. I thought, hey, we're free, but then maybe in some ways there still exist in, with others. And I have that personally, that challenge, and that how to cope with it when somebody said, no, my kids cannot play with your kids because your kids have dark skin. And that does not affect me, but affect the kid, where can I go? Am I allowed to go play somewhere? So it's just like the safety among ourselves with, the place within the community that we live in. It's just kind of either we are safe or we're not. We don't know.
Can I reiterate something on access to Medicaid? Up until it was 1995 when the welfare reform kicked in at Clinton's administration. Marshallese and COFA, all of a sudden they were disconnected from accessing these programs, especially the Medicaid. And I think initially people thought that they were, especially after the nuclear legacy with 67 bombs being detonated at our lands. Causing a high number of cancers, chronic diseases. And people really, prior to that, people thought they were going to have access to these programs. But when that kicked in, it was claimed that it was an accident. That's the biggest question now. If it was an accident, how come we haven't revisit that and fix that? As far as the Real ID Act was actually this was recently that was approved at both the Senate and the House.
In Arkansas.
Actually, at the federal level now. So we don't have that problem anymore. I'm glad states that are leading examples like Oregon folks and Washington area there, hopefully will be a good example to Arkansas. We're still battling with adults. Actually, that we have got a resolution approved by the governor last year for children, for COFA's children. So that's a big plus. But now, because many believes that it's still at the federal, it's still a federal issue when it comes down to reimbursement, how those movement of money are considered with the adult side. So that's the biggest struggle now. IOM, I think my recommendation for you folks, I think there's been that disconnection between IOM and the community, and I'm not sure what the relationship. I think I think it's important for us, IOM, outside of the island, outside of the United States, and those island communities here that exist in the United States to link up, because there's just so much of, to me, there's a lot of space for us to work together. Yes, especially when you're talking about, resources. How do you prepare folks prior to move here? And when they come here, we need to have resources for them as well. So I think, and I'm not sure how the connection is with the government back home, but I felt like there was no connection between that organization and the government back home. So maybe that need to be a little bit more stronger, and not in a bad way, but I just, just my recommendation.
Did you want to address the question?
Sure. So thanks for that question. So if I understood it correctly, the question is really, isn't migration sort of, one can think of it as just a massive abdication of dignity, right? Because of all the things that you lose when you leave a place and sort of go into the unknown. And I think that in some ways that must be true, because there's no doubt that you lose a lot of what sort of supports and nurtures your dignity, right? In terms of community, in terms of familiarity, family, whatever, all the things that you had at home that you sort of lose when you leave. But on the other hand, it's also sort of, you know, in some ways one of the biggest indications or one of the most significant expressions of human dignity that one can imagine, which is to say, where I am doesn't work for me for whatever reasons, whatever complex combination of reasons, and I'm going to go. Oh, I just realized I wasn't flashing at me. And I'm going to go and sort of forge a new life and make a better life for myself, for my children. And so in its best version, it's actually a way to enhance, to nurture, to promote one's individual dignity. And then when you have it on the scale that we're talking about, where it's not just an individual leaving, but also leaving with family, coming to a place where there's community, being embraced by a new community, it's a much broader form of sort of community and collective dignity also. I think that the challenge for this group and for sort of having a framework, a policy framework that calls attention to the need to have migration with dignity is, of course, how to minimize the costs of dignity, the dignity cost of migration, while maximizing the dignity advantages of migration. But I think that's possible to do if we think about it sort of in all these different steps and all these different variations that we see dignity being impacted in the very complex issue of migration.
Nikki, I was wondering if you might want to talk about the question, to what extent have we talked with policymakers in source countries? What do they think of all this?
You should go first.
Okay. So we have in both the Republic of the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia, we've talked to them, a variety of different officials and offices. At the very highest level, the politics seems to swing radically. Several years ago, when the Marshall Islands was having economic slow times, President of the Marshall Islands visited Springdale, looked around and said, yeah, this isn't bad, and encouraged people to move there. It wasn't because of climate change. It was just for opportunities. And so there are times that President Kiribati said, we need to migrate with dignity. We'll buy some land in Fiji, and we're going to, next president comes in and says, there's a big shift. And so I think that this is, there are very different views of climate change and migration. Is migration necessary? Is it good? Under what circumstances? There are some very clear benefits. The Marshall Islands, I think it's on the order of $8 million a year in remittances.
Yes.
So, you know, this is, and in a population of 50,000 on the islands, $8 million goes a ways. So there are benefits. There are also, frankly, challenges. When we were there, that even people who do come back, you know, they go abroad for education, they come back, they don't listen to their elders. You know, if you're under 30, you're supposed to sit there and be quiet. And you know, this is a cultural value. And they come, they learn to get a voice, and they go back and they want to continue using that voice. So I think that there's, I think the officials are struggling with some of these things. I think there's also, going back to one of Mickey's comments about studying the differences between atoll countries and volcanic countries, the other part that we see is that in both countries, it's not just international migration, but there's a lot of internal migration, especially like in Ponape is a beautiful island. It has this 700, 800-foot peak. It looks like Tahiti or Hawaii. It's gorgeous. And they have these outer islands, which look a lot like the Marshall Islands. They are very low. And already people are moving in, not necessarily because of sea level rise as such, but because of the saltwater intrusion and the crops don't grow. I mean, that is sea level rise, but it's not we're underwater, it's that our freshwater source is not reliable. So I think that there's a lot of internal migration.
Yes. And just one thing that in Majuro, we communicated with the people of my government, Japan, like embassy people or ODA agency people. And we asked whether that time Japanese government can do something for the Marshall Island under the assumption that this country would be submerged. Well, this discussion was made some 1 year ago. And that time we were told that no way, because the Republic of the Marshall Islands that time didn't mention openly that our land would be submerged and we do need a help. So we are told that, as long as they don't tell, we need a help because our land is to be submerged. We cannot do anything about climate change, refugee kind of issues. Well, I think it has been changed because I was in Majuro 2 weeks ago, and the same people told me that now the government asked Japan to help to raise the land and to save the land even after sea level rise. But well, still, as Carl mentioned that the policy of the government is swinging, and I don't think we have a very clear direction about it. I wonder if Melissa agrees to my assumption.
Well, Marshall Islands has the first female president in the region, like in the Pacific region in general. And I know that administration has gone through a lot, swinging, politics-wise. So I know she's very keen into raising the lands, but that has to the landlords and the chiefs need to say yes in order for that to move forward. So I've heard, all the time that I meet politicians from the islands, they come in and they say something, somewhere in the line of, people that, even statemen, people that move out of the island, they're cowards. So, that tells you how they feel. But then you have those other politicians who don't agree with that as well. So it'll be interesting. And I know having to leave those islands, that's your identity. So what happens after that? And I think that's what Hilda is really trying to do, is preserve our identity and our lands.
I'd like to just very quickly, if Shana or Scott or somebody else has comments on the different perceptions in ages. I know, Scott, in some of the things that you were saying, there were people come at different, the average age of the Palauans vis-a-vis the Marshallese. So we looked at what happened, what the students were thinking in the Marshalls, but the people over here were much older in most cases than that. And I don't know if you guys have thoughts on differences in ages of the respondents.
Age would be a factor. I don't have the data in my mind right now for it. Time of arrival, and also migration purpose. So we did look at those who intended to migrate for educational purposes, and perhaps not surprisingly, their educational achievement was much greater their job placement was much better, and they ended up in better jobs, and they had much lower challenges in obtaining employment. And it just went right down the line. For those who did not immigrate for educational purposes, but for job purposes, actually their success in these quality indicators was much lower. And just to reiterate, one question about what is the welcoming experience in Oregon, I think Kathy summed it up quite well when she said, we have to explain to them who we are. And most people don't know that they even exist, was my impression at least. And a number of folks in the interviews said that they often were mislabeled or categorized as other ethnic groups and just not known about. So they have to explain themselves and push for it.
Yeah, I think the same. I mean, with the intent to interview first people who were born in the Marshall Islands and then emigrated, we had a wide variety of age groups. So there was somebody as young as 18, but as old as 75. And so, and it was also to try to understand, you know, what, if there were differences among, you know, these different generations. And I think, I mean, there certainly were, but it was more experiential. So the ones that were younger were telling me stories about, you know, how similar to what Scott mentioned, you know, you go into school and it's assumed that you don't speak English, you know, so they're put in, you know, classes at a lower level than what they would have been if they were, you know, somehow treated, you know, like everybody else. And the job situation was also, you know, something that was notable, I would say, regarding the ages. But beyond that, I mean, we certainly tried to look at a number of different age groups, and then also kind of so culturally, there are elements within their society that speak to whether they traditionally hold positions that are more on the worker, you know, level, like where they're supporting chiefs or how, you know, families, or if they're working at a higher level, you know, are they the landowners themselves, et cetera. And so, I mean, you'd see, I think, also a lot of those that were more with the working level, the Irosh, that a lot of the challenges were within that level. You know, I mean, where do they go? What kind of role fits them? If you know, since it doesn't really exist in the United States like it did in the islands, where, I mean, maybe you'd like to speak a little bit about it too.
I think we're
at the end. Okay.
We're past time.
Okay.
So I want to just say very quickly, I think people can stay afterward if they want, but I do expect it's interesting. Some people have not thought much about Pacific Islands. It wasn't that long ago that these places were very important for different reasons. And I think that this topic is going to continue to be important for a few reasons. One, there's the equity side. I think it was mentioned, bombs. Bikini Atoll is part of the Marshall Islands. And there's the whole question of reparations and kind of righting past wrongs. There's the humanity side, that these are people that are suffering, they're struggling, and shouldn't we do something? And then there's the strategic side. And the strategic side, I think, is where it gets really interesting. Because Majuro, the capital of Marshall Islands, at one point during World War II was the busiest port in the Pacific. This is of great strategic importance. Most Americans don't know anything about this. And the COFA comes up for renewal. It expires in 2023. So we should now be thinking about, as a, you know, I expect there are people in the State Department who are thinking about what should the next steps be. And this is not, it's a very interesting time to be negotiating immigration. It gets more interesting when you realize that the Chinese are saying, hey, you want a new hospital? We'll build one for you. There are competitors in the negotiations. So I think this will continue to be a discussion, not only for the humanity, but also for the strategic side. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and thank you to the speakers.
Thank you. Great work.
It's a great show.
I need to get eyes on you.
I want to connect you.
So it's not-
Yeah.